Hello. It's very nice to be able to start this meeting, this live, to talk a little bit about philanthropy, rights, and I'll introduce myself. I am Cacá Verdade. I am the executive coordinator of Elas Plus. This is the Brazilian fund of Transformar. First of all, I would like to thank for the participation here and also mention our co-founder and general director of the institution, Iracema Souza, uh, who was one of the researchers, the co-researcher responsible for the research that we'll discuss today in this live, the research activism and the pandemic in Brazil, research that is available on our website. And it is in Portuguese and in English. I would also like to thank Natalia Caruso for her presence. She is the director of partnerships of Madre Institution. Alexandra Garida, that is the executive director of Próspera. Maria Eduarda Dantas, that is also a representative of ONU Mulheres, expert in human rights and facing violence against women, and Benjamin Balaji, that is the executive director of WINGS. So with this introduction and my thanks to for having you here with us, I pass on the floor to Amalia Fischer. She is the general coordinator of Elas Mais. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Kaká, and welcome you all, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone. It's a very special name for Elas. And I'll mention that in the end of my speech, because before I have to say how we started thinking about this research that is the most important point for this live today. And well, when the pandemic started and got all of us in the world by surprise, we would be celebrating our 20-year jubilee, and we had everything set to celebrate these 20 years when the pandemic started and we had to stop everything. And stop means rethinking Elas and rethink ourselves and reinvent ourselves. All our work was basically presential. We had dialogues and meetings, and everything was via mail. So we had to adapt to the digital era by force. And at the same time, a lot of our grant making was via projects that were already in the strategic planning, and we were thinking about what would change in the model because we needed to support the organizations, collectives, and women's group and organizations related to LGBTQI in such a way that we could strengthen our movements. But the pandemic speed everything up. So we changed a lot. We now have a wonderful platform. We now are at this moment online, okay? And 2 years ago, we wouldn't even think about it. And we were the first in the philanthropic ecosystem in Brazil. We were one of the first to to put to consider the importance on the trust of the civil society organizations. And we started taking a greater space than we had in this ecosystem of philanthropy in Brazil. And we also could acknowledge our work. So last year, we, I mean, well, in 2020, 2021, we launched calls for bids that wouldn't be directed for projects. They were flexible. And last year, we had the biggest one in our history. We'll discuss this during the event. I won't be ahead here because they will talk about the research and the ideas they had. And I accepted because I think it was really wonderful to build knowledge once again, because we were working hard in this context that we were living. And you already know, I won't mention any character because but we are happy to think about it. But anyway, we worked hard to welcome more and more the organizations. Anyways, Kaká had this idea. She will talk about it to us. And we invited some researchers, and you will also hear them. You will hear Iracema, because she's wonderful. She's incredible. And you can see that I'm very nervous here at this moment. I'm very anxious. I couldn't even think about what to say now, because this morning, a friend, a very dear friend, called me. She called Denise Vidal, and I'm mentioning her because she's been following us over these last 21 years. And she said, Amalia, congratulations. And I said, why, Denise? My birthday was 15 years ago. And she said, no, I'll show you. I hadn't opened my email yet because I was working with the communication area, precisely working on this live that we would have now. But then I said, and Denise talked about it to me, and I got quite nervous and anxious and everything at the same time. And it was because we were contemplated along with other organizations, and we have two organizations in this live here today, but we were contemplated by the cycle of donations of Emma Case Scott. That is, she launched the list today. So we are very touched, very happy. And mainly this live, because this live is at this moment of acknowledgement to a work that has been very difficult. We work little by little with a lot of knowledge of many women, women that had already funded different funds and that were part of Elas fund, were co-founders of other funds, our partners with whom we learn a lot. Some of them are here today. And also, it has to do with our commitment to feminism, our commitment to women's rights and gender equity and LGBTQI plus rights, because we have no sponsors. This 21-year work is a very hard work, very, very difficult to have a fund of social justice that is feminist. I mean, a feminist philanthropy in this ecosystem of philanthropy that is conservative. So it's nothing easy. But today we have this acknowledgement. So I'm really very happy, very touched, and I would like to share that with you. Other organizations that are here, if you want to say something when it's your time to speak, it would be wonderful to share that with you. And well, I think that Benjamin, if you want to talk a little bit about how it influences this attitude, this courage of Mackenzie and Scott, and how will it influence philanthropy over the next years? I personally think that it's wonderful. And at the same time, well, I would like to thank Mackenzie and Mackenzie's team, because they found us and we met each other. So that's it. I'm very touched. Okay, Kaká, the floor is yours. Well, it's really very touching at this moment. I will also let you free if you want to comment on something, but I would also like to congratulate you all. I received the list and I could see Prospera, Madri, so I think it's a history conquer of these movements and organizations led by women, focusing on their mission and having resources and giving viability to projects and initiatives of women with gender equity and race equity and social justice, and bring all that to the world. So congratulations, Prospera and Madri, for this achievement. I don't know if you want to say something, Natalia, if you want to say something about it before we go into the research.
Just to say thank you, I think I want to also congratulate Alexandra and Prospera. I think this is a win for all of us, right? Like it's sort of the recognition that there is more to do and more funding is needed. So definitely at Madre, we have a commitment to continue advancing the agenda of local grassroots organizations, whatever those are. And I'm really excited to, to continue doing the work with all of, with all the groups here in the call, but also, in different regions of the world. So thank you. And yes, I think we should all celebrate because it's a win for all of us. Yes.
Alex?
Yes, congratulations, Elas Mas and Madre and Prospera. And I think it's just, as you all have already said, a huge, not just win, but also, I think if there's ever been a moment of proof of concept, as they say, this is it, right? Like we know that women's funds work and how they work and why they work. And I think your research that we will be talking about today highlights the why better than many other things that I've ever seen. And I think these gifts are a recognition of that, of what the feminist funding movement is able to really do, including influencing philanthropy itself. So really interesting to hear from UN Women and Wings and others, how they're also perceiving these shifts in philanthropy and how we can ensure that more and better resources go to women's rights organizations, trans LBT organizations, who are often the ones who don't get many resources. So it is now our turn with these resources to really transform the field. And I think we can do that. Like collectively, Prospera members have received $160 million from Mackenzie Scott in the last year. And I think that that's huge. So I think, and it's for our movements. And I think it's going to be really fascinating to see in 5 or 10 years the impact of all that. So it's very exciting. So congratulations to all of us and looking forward to our conversation.
Ok, muito bom, gente, muito bom esse momento. Dá muita vontade da gente...
Okay, great, excellent. It makes us feel the need to start talking about this, but we have to go back to our team, our life, that it's about the research about activism pandemic in Brazil. So when we start facing the first consequence of the COVID pandemic, quickly, Elas in Brazil start receiving more requests from the organizations led by women, and they are asking for more resources. And starts appearing requests that are in a way that are new, things that were not as requested, they start being requested as, for example, resources for humanitarian health, resources connected to health and care that were not exactly the focus or the biggest part of our investment. The first period of the pandemic, the first consequence of the pandemic, where we see inequality scenarios becoming deeper and deeper. It's a time where no one knew how long it would last, what were the consequences of the pandemic, and no one had an answer and say, oh, I think we should do like this. No one knew how to operate, how to work in any sector, not only in the philanthropy and social justice sector. I think that we didn't know how to work, how to deal with the economy, and in a general way. So we start thinking, what is strategical right now? We need to go back and we need to focus to one research to get to know what's happening, because they were things that were very different from what we are used. And we focus in opening a communication channel inside the institution to receive informations. So we start receiving informations from the groups on how the organizations were being affected. One of the questions is this: how is the organization being affected by the pandemic? The second research was focused to the community or the territory where the organization works. So how your community, how your territories where they work, how the territory was affected by the pandemic up to now. And the third question that I think it's a question that brought us a lot of information about the transformational power, the action power of the civil society organizations, especially the ones that were led by women in Brazil, and how your organization is going through these obstacles, is going through these consequences. How are you working in this? How you're activists in a time of during this crisis as the pandemic, as the COVID pandemic. And with this, we start understanding how we could work as a brand maker. It's important how we were able to better organize the resources that we had, how we could actually know better, actually know that the field of this, the number of organizations that were led by women in Brazil. And we also realized that this knowledge, it is more important not only for Elas, but for the entire social philanthropy field, that it's going to invest resources in Brazil. So we think, well, this is good to show what are the characteristics that this movement had, the social movements in Brazil, in terms of, for me to be able to invest, to have a better investment, what do I have to change as an institution? What can I adapt to be able to meet these organizations led by women in Brazil? We can understand that what are the type of strategies that the organizations are using, where are they are not understanding everything, where are they successful. We were able to see the speed of the answer. I'm not sure what is more interesting to observe in this research, if it is the capability of this resilience, this adaptation that they have to be able to lead new initiatives against a crisis that no one knew the answer. This capacity to invent solutions, this social solutions, or if it's the speed in where they implement those ideas, the speed. It was amazing. It was amazing to see. For you to have an idea, we saw uh, uh, grassroots organizations developing mechanisms to pass these resources, this emergency resources, that and they were working fast 6 months earlier than the government, than the Brazilian government, that and they were faster than everything that the government had. So it's actually amazing. That is why Amalia asked me to tell why we were with this idea of doing this research last year. And this is the answer. I think that it makes it possible for us to better invest, for us to invest in a better speed and escape from some stereotypes. For those who support resources philanthropy in Brazil, sometimes that you have the impression that the region, the Southeast region and South region are the region that are more active in terms of organizations that has a longer history. And this is not true in Brazil. In Brazil, it's Southeast and Northeast. This is where we have the biggest mobilizations of organizations. That another thing that we don't realize, for example, most of these organizations, I think 50 something percent, something like that, I'm going to bring during the Senate presentation to better explain this data. But more than half of the organizations in Brazil in this past year during the pandemic and in the previous year where the pandemic started, they do not have any formal registration. Those are organizations that they are not registered. So if you are an investor, if you are a partner that invests and you're doing public calls or you're donating to these organizations, the mechanisms available must be able to support groups that are not formal, that are not registered. If your organization are only able to donate to registered group, you're excluding more than half the organizations from your opportunity, the opportunity that you're giving them. So it's important for us to know other things. For example, in Brazil, most of the organizations led by women are led by Black women. So everything that they have to go through this gender inequality, and this is connected to this race inequalities, and is also connected to racism that is structural in the Brazilian society. Other important thing that we are able to find out during this research, the capability of organizing things inside the indigenous movements and the diversity of projects and fights inside this. We have some measures, and I think that Madre can contribute telling us about this. Which are the indigenous movements that would work only in the environmental issues, territory issues, as these were the only fights that these social movements can act. But this is not the truth. We are able to receive, in the research, we're able to see this diversity of the indigenous movements that they have. They have many of them with women that are leading, and they're indigenous women with this agenda against this gender inequality that it's being, it's the focus. We are able to see indigenous women movement working with LGBT and diversity, sexual diversity and gender. So it means they are going through different areas, different themes. And I think that this research makes us getting rid of the stereotypes that we can eventually reproduce or. So I think that this was the big motivation of this research and the effort to translate it into English to be able to make it available through this live. So everyone that is interested in this activism in Brazil is able to use this information on what we want for more resources for this women lead and to be able to transform, to have the social transformation in Brazil. So with this big introduction, I'll now pass the floor to Iracema Souza, that has a master's degree in social sciences and it's doing its PhD. And it was one of the co-researchers responsible by this activism pandemic research here in Brazil. So, Iracema, tell us a little bit more about the research, please. Hello, good afternoon. I'm going to start sharing my screen so you can follow here some of the results that we have with the research that we developed throughout 2021. As Kaká already presented, it's a portrait of the starting moment of the pandemic in Brazil, how the pandemic was here and demanded strategies, this mobilization strategies from those groups. So we have this specific look of this period. So we have the context of research in Brazil. The data were collected in June 2020. That was a public call that Elas opened for Women in Movement program and has as its characteristic the flexible support. In the context that we had in Brazil, we didn't have enough information about COVID, not only in Brazil, but around the world. In this process, we also had the growth on inequality due to the economical difficulties. So we have this, we were reducing the work and reducing the revenue. So the isolation measures that were taken by the country were a big impact in the Brazilian family's life because the workers that were not registered, it's very present, and we're going to see this in the strategies that were developed to fight this delicate moment that we are living in.
And our research could reach 953 organizations responding to the forms with the data or who consented to use the data for the research. So in terms of geographic distribution, we also identified, as Kaká mentioned, that there is a representation from the point of view of regions. In Brazil, we have 5 different regions, and among the respondents, we had representatives in all regions of the country in a biggest ratio according to the population distribution. So in the Southeast and Northeast, we have more concentration of groups and population as well. This national distribution also shows diversity from the point of view of the population and its composition. The majority of the population is of Black, but with a different regional distribution. In the North and Northeast, we have more Black people and indigenous people, whereas South and Southeast has more white population, and they are also very uneven regions. North and Northeast are poorer with more inequality compared to the other regions with more income. From the point of view of leaderships, the leadership of Black women has been shown expressive in more than 70% of the groups. This composition of the groups are not only characterized by one leadership profile. So we see that we have about 50% of LBT leadership. I mean, in this case, 44.1%. And indigenous leadership, 10.4% of the groups had an indigenous leadership, and the leaderships were majority or uniquely of indigenous or in groups with more diverse composition from the point of view of leadership. profile. As Kaká also mentioned, 55.7% is the percentage of our non-formal organization. This difference from this point of view is not expressive, but you can see that the flexibility of resource and the possibility of non-formal groups claim allowed us to have this data. If it was a restrict or forbid to formal organizations, we wouldn't have this view and this portrait, which happens generally with national organizations mapping the civil society, but only considering the formal ones. The non-formalization has an impact on the income and the resources of organizations mobilize, as we could see, for example, 54% of organizations led by women during the whole year of 2019-2020 mobilized up to $4,000, which would be in Brazil about 20,000 reais during the whole year. It's a very low amount if we observe that in 12 months, it's no more than one minimum wage. Generally, it's less in the case of Brazil. So when we look beyond the mobilization and we see the quantitative aspects of the resource, we also see from the point of view of who the funders are. And here we have the self-funding. This is something very strong in women movements because they are initiatives given back by the organizations funding their own actions. So we can emphasize here the individual donors, the events, volunteers, and sales. And it's interesting because these four categories presenting as the majority in the process, they were also deeply affected because when we see a reduction of the family income and economical potential of these families and these work activists, it also affects the mobilization of activism. And one of the results that we see right in the beginning and how the group is affected is the reduction in resources that we'll see later on as well. From the point of view of participation, international participation in terms of resources, the groups mention a lot that among the fundings, they are in the ones with least expression, similar to the national governments. So we have NGOs with a 6.5%, private foundation 6%, and multilateral agencies with a 3.8 international funders with less expression. So the context was what the pandemic was and how the groups organized it and suffered the first impact of this context in the communities and territories. So what could we identify? What was mentioned more is the loss of employment and consequently income. There's also in this process an increase of violence, like domestic violence. We have a family reconfiguration process that workers start being with the rest of the family, and it has a negative effect, socially speaking. So we have an increase in domestic violence and also an increase in police violence in the peripheries, even with the police actions in the period that was a legal determination that it was prevented, they were prevented to work this way, but it happened and the numbers were high, and violence against LGBTI+, which was also expressive. We have some surveys identifying that in fact, changing our behavior because we were in isolation made the violence against the LGBTI+ population stronger. What we also identified was the increased, I don't know if it is increased, but I mean the evidence of digital inequalities because the impossibility of dealing presentially and the face-to-face interaction demanded from groups a reorganization for activism via social media and mobiles and digital universes. So it gave visibility of different inequalities in this sense, like access to devices or access to internet or even information on how to use it. There was also in this process a lack of information, so there was proliferation of fake news on how to protect and also provide information with the growth of mental problems. The indigenous groups, for example, they complained a lot about suicide. It was very present in their territories where they were inserted. And here I brought a little bit on how the communities were affected via the report. So I would like to mention here just how they reported that, because there was the loss of employment, which impacts the family income and the activism as well. But at the same time, there was the need and the lack of viability of some activities, not only to losing their jobs, but also the possibility of marketing, for example, possibility of creating a network that works to ensure the income for the groups. It was all deeply affected, even due to the need of protection, which generated anxiety, mental problems due to this condition and this uncertainty situation. As Kaká mentioned, the governmental actions took long to be effective as public policies. So it has some repercussion mainly to the families, depending on the income for the day. I mean, they work for the day. This is what they have to buy food for, to eat. So they don't know what is the next meal. So a day without working for that family will be a day without living well. And another thing that was reported is that group had difficulties to access resources, not anymore in terms of family income in the institutions. There was some step back in the possibilities of resources. There was a difficulty in terms of negotiating the resources of the projects that were already there. So there was no possibility of flexibilization because the pandemic demanded the reorganization of activism. So many groups worked on emergency activities and bringing information and levels of care, and some resources were not viable for this flexibility. And this is another aspect. The COFABID is flexible from the point of view of organizations and the use of resources, which allowed innovative strategies and more adequate to the need of that moment could be developed. So here, in this first narration, there is even the need to build new methodologies for activism, because the activism based on living and hugging and presentially dealing among themselves were prevented due to the pandemic and the need to protect yourself and protect the beloved ones. So what are the strategies to summarize and that are expressed in this place? We have a massive engagement of the groups, whether with the resources, I mean, the resources they had back then, with the ones available for them, to comply with the more emergent needs like hunger that was still also stronger in Brazil, and the distribution of items, because in terms of health and masks, some communities, some populations in Brazil had no access to fresh water or alcohol or soap to wash their hands. And with all this process of information and items distribution, they could develop that. Along with that, there was the need of redemption of activism, I mean, to ensure support and guide the actions to what was the emergency, what was there at the moment, and the need of adaptation and readaptation to the context of isolation and online activities. So many strategies to guide the activists on how to use the instruments and the different networks, and the need to review the actions to this new context of readaptation. Some could do that, Some other focused on emergency activities, but we can see that there was no total stop. There was a moment of shock, but then the strategies were developed and found solutions in a fast and needed way to the demands of the communities and the works of places of work. So here, initiative of mask distribution that goes from the production of the mask with job generation and marketing and distribution and information. So there was a whole network built with a specific action. And this is one thing that we call your attention, this capacity of creating a network and having different actors and players to reach many people with one single initiative that would be mass distribution. But we have to consider that women are unemployed and we insert them in this job and then we distribute, and with that we inform with brochures and pamphlets being distributed along with the mask. As I said, the creation of the brochures with information, and also when this resource is approved by government, there is some policy to support this emergency situation. So this policy cannot reach the other extreme according to their needs, in the sense that all the process was online and many families couldn't access this public policy. They had no device, no connection. So it demanded another action, that is to make the recording and registration viable, and the resource would be available by the government and the population would access, even the ones in a situation of extreme frailty. So what is the conclusion that we can have here? There is a very great need for investment. We can see how low is the mobilization of resources despite creativity, but we need to strengthen that so that more innovative actions with a more comprehensive reach can be there. And the leadership of Black women that are so strong in activism, and they are inserted in many places, so they are highlighted there. We could also see indigenous leadership with dialogues in the discussions, and what was presented in the discussions with the horizontal philanthropy that was manifested in many ways with the distribution of resources, as Kaká mentioned, but also with seeds, because there was a problem on how to give a step back. There was the production, but not how to market. So there was such an organization so that everything was distributed to people.
This fast answer to those different contexts and the groups that were inserted in this locus that maybe should look at this, the policy management that goes from up to down cannot reach. And this capability, as Kaká said, of the resilience and to reinvent themselves. So during this challenge of a scenario that it's new, completely new, and new demands, and that will demand new actions and new ways to connect, we are able to see through the actions of these women. So I leave here the link of the research for those who are interested. We have English and Portuguese version, and that's it. Thank you, Iracema. It's great to hear you bringing a few data that are very impressive. And one of the ones that least fund organizations led by women in Brazil are the private sector. So we have the companies, national and international companies. So this private initiative is one that is not supporting these organizations led by women in Brazil. So, for example, with this research, we are able to see this great opportunity, this space, so people get inspired in the sector to have this type of investments, to be allied to institutions from the sector. as the independent funds here in Brazil, and also to encourage so they can level up this investment, so can have this great potential of investment to be explored and developed. So I will call Natalia because you brought some informations that we are able to collect, especially about organizations led by women and indigenous people. So Natalia Caruso, that it's leading making partnership strategies. Madri. So I pass the floor to you, Natalia, so you can talk and say what you think it's interesting to give this contribution about the resource.
Thank you. Thank you, Kaka. Thank you, Amalia. And thank you all for inviting me to this conversation. I think I'm Natalia Caruso, the director of Making and Partnership at Madre, a feminist fund and international women's human rights organization working with local partners in communities affected by disaster and war. And I want to first acknowledge the research and the efforts from Elas colleagues that you could see in this call in resourcing frontline communities in Brazil, right? Like it's really important to us at this moment to uplift this model of funding and to celebrate the research, but also continue contributing what is next. I think the research is an incredible evidence-based tool to influence the philanthropic sector, as Kaka was just referring, and to get to sort of demystify some of the impediments and stereotypes about how difficult it is to reach those communities that are at the front line of the crisis, not just the COVID crisis, but other, larger political crisis. I think it's really important to understand, as the research does, the context and local communities of a diverse country like Brazil, to deepening the understanding of what Iracema was referring, the local strategies and ways of activism, from survival to resistance, but also to what it takes to mobilize communities beyond that crisis. And more importantly, I think, which is really, a celebration for everybody that has been doing this research, was like to listen deeply. You could see in the quotes, you could see in the interviews, the intention to listen and centering the needs from women and LBTI activists that has been historically at the margins of receiving funding, as Kaka was also saying, but that thanks to Elas have received flexible support, which is really meaningful to confront the COVID crisis, but also to reinvent some of the strategies, depending on their communities and their needs. So based on the research summary, I wanted to bring a few points that I think are really important in this, are relevant in this conversation. One, I think the importance of collaborations and bringing here the collaboration that Madre has with Elas. We begin a model of collaboration with Elas years back, and because we at Madre identified that the socio-political context in Brazil needed more attention, but also more funding. So instead of funding directly, right, and we could have gone and just say, Kaka, give us some recommendations of which groups you think we could fund. We decided, based on our model of grant making, to join efforts with Elas, because we see that we are very much aligned on the vision and the values, and because we also want to make sure that local women's funds are, have the solidarity of international organizations like Madre, but we just don't duplicate and take room, right? But basically that we could support their efforts and the work that they're advancing. So we started a collaboration funding many of the groups. We started talking at the beginning, right? Like the need for particularly indigenous and Black communities that were under resources, but also the LBTI groups that were under threat. And I'm basically really looking at the groups that are not necessarily being reached by government programs or the traditional philanthropy. And we saw the need to reach those local groups at the margins, defending territories, advancing rights, and responding to many of the human rights violations like land grabbing, racism, and political violence. So then the COVID pandemic brought a new layer of challenges. And we were talking with Elas colleagues and Kakan, like, what can we be doing to be more flexible and more responsive to what these communities are facing, both on the emergency, but also on the long run. And Elas was well positioned to respond with flexible funding to groups that were most impacted by the crisis. But then also that takes me to my second point, right? Like that decision was to really be focusing on funding grassroots frontline groups, many of which, as Emma was saying, right? Like are informal and non-registered groups, but play the role of first responders for emergency humanitarian aid. They organize effort for survival and adapt their work in new ways. So we think that is very crucial when we have these conversations, how we could be really much resourcing those grassroots groups that really need the support, but I actually are advancing the emergency, but also are advancing and holding the line for larger human rights struggles and gender equality agenda. So groups like we were hearing a minute ago, Black, that are led by Black, LBTIs, Indigenous, that have showed up to the action in the face of the new challenge during COVID. And as you have heard also, many of these groups did more than just the emergency. I think I also want to point out that they have this community-driven aid model, right? When many communities organize to do food distribution, to do actions aimed at controlling the spread of the virus and socializing more information about how you could prevent the spread of the pandemic, distribution of natural medicines, emotional, psychosocial support, some of the income generating efforts that we heard, and also the self-financing actions that I think are really important also to point out, as the communities are well positioned to know what they need, but also are very well positioned to drive this type of actions for the survival and also to adapt in new ways for the upcoming challenges, right? So as we heard, women and LBTI groups were active to respond also with shelter and counseling and provide digital equality and reinvent their own activism in ways that were new to them and new to the sector. But also, I think they have been responsive to to the political ramifications of the crisis, right? Like to be able to, as I was saying, hold the line that in defense of their rights. I was really pleased to see in the research, to uplift some of the groups were facilitated dialogue between the community and the state, that they mediated access to programs that otherwise will not reach those communities, that they have developed strategies to mitigate the rollback of their rights during this crisis in order to guarantee the survival and the support that they could bring to the communities and territories. And my last point is just to, how do we think together as Alexandra was saying also, right? Like as all of us being part of this ecosystem, how do we continue to support those frontline groups in times of crisis, but also beyond this crisis, right? Like the title of the event is Activism and the Pandemic in Brazil. So we want to also pay attention to the activism and what needs to be in terms of support, being there for support, to address the impact of the pandemic, but also to continue to support the activism of women and LBTI groups and communities that are transforming the impact of this crisis, but they're demanding rights and advocating for many of the policies and rights that were lost as a result of the pandemic. I think we need to celebrate, every day these groups, but also not just during emergencies. We need to collectively give support because ultimately we want to contribute to address some of the existing inequalities as poverty, marginalization, political challenges, and come better off from this crisis, right? Like we need to center the needs and voices of those who have been at the margins and make sure that we collectively have the support and the commitment to fund Black, Indigenous, women with disabilities and young people, women in rural areas and quilombolas, trans people from all regions of Brazil to bring the social transformation in the country, but also in the region. So thank you so much for having me here. And I want to participate of the conversation of the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Beautiful words and so generous from your side, to share with us your sharp vision on the conclusions that you had on the research. So thank you so much for your words. Vou chamar agora, então, a Maria Eduarda.
Now I will call Maria Eduarda Dantas.
Traz pouco desse olhar, de especialista em direitos humanos.
That will bring a little bit of this look in fighting, searching for human rights. And what do you think about the research, Maria Eduarda, working in UN Women in an organization like this, that it's able to have this global point of view and how the pandemic impacted women? So you can feel free to bring your contributions. For sure, Kaká, good afternoon. I'd like to congratulate you, everything in Elas Fund, the technical team that is making this time possible, my colleagues here from the live, and everyone that is following this broadcast live. I'm very happy to be able to be here with you and contribute for this type of dialogue and this construction time, this building, this knowledge time. And I can see that UN Women, we are seeing how COVID is impacting and still impacting those people in those groups where the human rights were already violated historically. And this include women, especially LBTI women, Black women, Indigenous, Quilombola, the rural workers, the youth, the house workers. So this group that it's being represented in this research that Elas Plus it's getting today.
And the rights of women were more affected because they are more exposed to economic and social impacts. More obviously, the political ones that increased with the pandemic, but a global research of ONU Mulheres and PNUD showed that due to the pandemic, the ideas that we have of poverty reduction among women were reduced both in Brazil and worldwide. And from the point of view of funding and philanthropy, that is what we are discussing, this scenario was stronger. Obviously, we have a scenario of women that was quite well discussed here, and it happened due to losing the opportunities they have of self-financing the work plans and, I don't know, selling handcraft or their own work in events and production of stuff that we discussed, and also with the resources coming from the work income of these women, this leadership, or also because donors stopped giving money to actions in emergent support and things that would not necessarily in line with the gender and race and ethnicity and the real demands of women. And regarding the work they developed, and I'm reporting the experience of ONU Mulheres based on what you are presenting with this research, but we've been observing that women, especially the organized women, regardless of being in formal organizations, they were quite important, and they also were in the front line to respond to the pandemic. But also they were keeping and maintaining human rights during this period in the many fronts, and consequently they also became more vulnerable to attacks, threats, and many other different works in activism that changed a lot in this world. So the movement, women's movement, had to adapt quite fast and in very adverse conditions. It demanded innovation, as Natalia was sharing and analyzing as well with us. And innovating means searching for new ways of having incidents with lives, for example, as we are doing today. and creating virtual stores, for example, with online strategies, trying to deal with the inequalities that we have with infrastructure, and also dealing with the new risks of security that we have with more predominance of this digital means in activism that we also observed. But it also means recovering new different ways of doing things that we could also observe in this period. So we had organizations using radio to fight lack of information in territories where internet is not there yet. It's not an efficient way. And the biggest value of knowledge and traditional practices and ancestral knowledge to take care of health, and also to deal with basic stuff like eating. So during this period, we can say that women had to have new partnerships. They needed to learn new things. They influenced the response of other players to the pandemic, which is quite important and mandatory. Also to say that despite everything that we know that is there, the results they could reach during this period was to keep up organizing and working in networks and protecting other women and their families and communities and peoples. So this result must be acknowledged and valued. So Cacau, I think that besides contributing to this knowledge and this value of the work of women defending human rights in Brazil during this period that is very important, this research is showing what kind of funding strategy works to reach the Black women, as we were seeing, because more than 70% of them in this research are Black. And so how to reach indigenous women and LGBTI women. So this is the kind of strategy that is quite well represented in Elas and the partners, allowing the creation of gender agendas that are truly intersectional, because part of the women are there with these priorities and agendas and strategies of work. And I think we want to encourage all the ecosystem of donors and players to be aware and take that into consideration, especially when we start to bring this debate to philanthropy and funding, to this kind of action, let's say those recovery actions after the pandemic. This is what I had to share with you today. So congratulations, Alice, for the research, and congratulations to all the team to create this research, and also congratulations on the wonderful news that we were sharing in the beginning that Amalia mentioned. We are very happy and we celebrate along with you. Thank you very much, Maria Eduarda. Very nice to have your contribution here and understand that a research that we have located here in Brazil is in fact related and brings also findings of ONU Mulheres worldwide. This is very nice. Now I will invite Alex Garita, my dear Executive Director of Prosper, to talk a little bit about what is important and why is it important to have this feminist philanthropy and all the efforts that we make with a research like this. Why do we engage so much? Prospera is a fund network of international women that we are part of, and we are very proud to be part of this history since the beginning. So tell us a little bit about what came after that. What are the results of this research and what effect it had on you?
So I think you know the effect it had on me, because the first thing I did when I saw it was I told you and Amalia that this was amazing. We often don't have this kind of knowledge coming from, in my position, from women's funds. And we've been, from the Secretariat of Prospera, trying to get this type of information for a very long time, because this is what demonstrates what you do so well. And this makes the case for why women's funds are so critical to actually resourcing movements in ways that other type of NGOs or funders can't reach them. And so I think the importance of this research is huge. And I hope that we can have something like this in the network in Prospera so that you can also share with your peers what this research has done and what it's enabled and how it will hopefully transform funding for grassroots communities in not just times of crisis, I would say in our world today, which is deeply unequal and harmful by the governments, and in situations of authoritarianism and closing of civic space and a global pandemic and on the brink of World War III. Like, this is the type of, I think, research, information, knowledge, and connection to actual movements that we need to highlight and to have much more voice in. And I say this because this is what we know works for the sustainability of life, of movements, of justice, of organizations. What works is precisely what you're documenting in this research, which is the type of organizing that happens between feminists and social justice activists, which is different from the way in which institutions and organizations often design their work. And the beauty, I think, of what you've done here is to demonstrate how Fundo Elas listens, as Natalia said very clearly, how brave you are in holding each other's hands with the movements that you support throughout these multiple crises, and how you weave the solidarity between you all. So there's an element here, I think, of humility, which is not something that we often talk about in philanthropy or in social justice circles, because we're very self-righteous about the type of work that we do, and we love to toot our horns and talk about how great we are. And there's an element, I think, of how this process is one of humility and of really walking in the shoes of others and of empathy. And I think that's the beauty of feminist funding, and that's the beauty of Elas Más, and that's what we see captured in this research, which I really hope is we are going to use it a lot, and we're going to invite our other members in Prospera to try and do similar things in their context as they can, because I do think that this is feminist philanthropy at the end of the day. It's how you do the work. It's not just what you're funding, but how you're funding and how you're accompanying and how you stay for the long term. There's this saying that I learned a long time ago, which is that feminists have what's called staying power. It's a power to stay no matter what. You don't leave. And it doesn't mean organizations, it means the movement. And when you are at the service of movement and you stay, that's powerful because it builds over time. These aren't jobs for most of us and for the activists that are on the ground. This is our life in so many ways. And so how do we demonstrate that what you have captured here in terms of the support to often the most marginalized constituencies in your country, Black women of diverse backgrounds, sexualities, expressions, Indigenous women who are finding a different conversation and dialogue because you've enabled that space to happen and to create the connections within movements. I mean, in such a diverse country like Brazil, the fact that Fundo Elas has been able to actually create the space for all of these actors in different ways to dialogue with each other for years now, I mean, that really is power, collective power and collective strength. And I hope that we see that power translated into the elections in a few months in your country. And that we can also, take a little bit of credit of how social change happens, because Elas exists and because feminist funding exists, in the sense that the expansion of these networks and the distribution of resources and the sort of very central piece of holding equity and non-discrimination and empathy is central to the way in which you do that work. And I think this research really highlights a lot of that. I think the numbers are ghastly. Your, statistics of 4,000 US dollars per organization, like, even with these great announcements of Mackenzie's got money, like it is nothing in comparison to what is needed. And so I think we need to really galvanize in much more, I think, impactful ways to shift resourcing to go to these groups to actually sustain that activism over time and not burden them with the types of formats and organizing formalities that tend to take away from that really important activist work, as Natalia was saying. So I think you're really, this research really does give, I think, a lot of direction and a lot of setting of trends and of how funders need to fund in such a complex country like Brazil. And so I think it's going to be really important how this information is communicated and disseminated, and we all take a role in ensuring that that's out there and that we point to it as a reference for how feminist funding actually works. So when people talk about feminist funding principles or participatory grant making or trust-based philanthropy or shifting the power or all these words that sound great, but they don't actually have examples to point to, this is a very clear example of all of those things. So I'm really grateful to all of you for doing such an important work, and looking forward to supporting you in making it really loud and impactful for the world.
Wow, thank you so much, Alexandra. I feel very touched by your words, and acho que eu quero já agradecer também, né, a sensibilidade.
I think I want to thank you for Natalia, for Natalia's words, yours, and also Maria Eduarda, and your sensibility to observe the importance of what we do and how we do it. During this research, we were able to bring a parts of testimonies from the activists, because we believe that we shouldn't talk for them. We have to listen. We shouldn't listen and say what we understood from that. So we had to make sure that we would bring and highlight this testimony. It's them are talking. They are talking. So I think that you being able to realize this, it tells a lot about this feminist philanthropy. So this feminist affect that it makes possible, that makes this possible. So I want to celebrate and thank you for your sensibility. And with this, I pass the floor to Benjamin Ballage, that is the executive director of Wings. So please, I pass the floor to you, Benjamin. So feel free to speak in Portuguese or English, or if you want to mix both languages also. And also to tell us a little bit more about Wings. I think it would be important. Thank you. Thank you, Kaká. Yes, I was thinking, am I going to speak in Portuguese, English? Maybe I will speak French. Well, no, but I think I will. I will use a little bit of the English because it's what I use in Wings, that it's a global language and has a headquarter here in Brazil. That's why I speak a little bit of Portuguese.
thank all the speakers. I think it was just so incredible to listen to the results of the survey, of the research, all these inspirational, talks that were shared by our colleagues. I think it was really impressive, and I shared what Alexandra was saying about being humbled and sort of the humility. I think that comes through, and that forces the humility of those who are engaging in this dialogue or in this reflection with you. So really, really impressed. And I think everything that was said really echoes some of the things that also, as a practitioner in the past, I've identified, even if I'm not myself, in the gender philanthropy space specifically. It's more broad work that we do at Wings about strengthening the philanthropic sector as a whole. For example, what you presented from the results of the survey around the capacity of women's-led organizations to respond very quickly in a very agile, very relevant way to the shock of the pandemic, I think is something I've also experienced when in the past I was in charge of post-emergency programs in a great making foundation, and we used to support all sorts of projects, including trying to support local organizations. And it was in Nepal. It was almost 10 years ago now, and there was this terrible earthquake, and we were seeing a number of actors and international NGOs and others trying to sort of figure out how to act, what to do. And at some point we had a project proposed by a women's organization called Tewa. And the project was, according to our usual criteria, was not really very strong. We were like, wow, it's not very detailed. We don't really know what they're going to do. What exactly are they trying to achieve? So they're looking at our usual frameworks and indicators and stuff. But then we saw, okay, they are a well-recognized actor, and we had a kind of trust through networks and other partners that they had, and we said, okay, let's trust, and we'll see what happens. And when I went there, just after a few weeks of work, I was completely amazed by the results they had achieved with very little resources, using a lot of volunteering, and without so much planning ahead, and without some all these heavy requirements that you were all referring to. And the results were incomparably greater to those of the more traditional organizations we had supported. So just to give an example, and until now, that specific story is something that I remember. I always remember. That's probably the best, one of the most interesting or the best projects I've seen on the ground, and that was with very little resources. And just because the woman organization that was leading that was just very much in phase with reality, and they were able to understand the needs very, very organically and very effectively. So that's not a surprise. And at the same time, I agree it's very important that this is being documented, that can be shared, and that can influence the broader sector, so that more and more actors, including in our case, in philanthropic actors, can really work in support of this type of more local organizations. And also because it's not just a matter of quick response or fast response, but I think that these type of actors are, and particularly women's fund and women's-led organizations have are intrinsically about systemic change. Even if they might be working on the sort of immediate response to a crisis, but just the way it's being done, and the sort of social structures that it's using are bringing about a broader systemic change. So I think it's really important, and that I think that when we look at that, we say, why is it so little funding? So of course there's the fantastic news about Mackenzie Scott. I was just so excited, just like you, to hear that. So congratulations, that's absolutely amazing. But still, we're wondering why so little resources going to these local actors when the evidence is getting clearer and clearer. And I think that it's really, really important to look at a couple of things. First is the question of trust. That there's a lack of trust. There's a lack of grant making first, especially in emerging economies. where actually, and we can make a correlation with the predominant role of corporate philanthropy in these regions, where most of the corporate philanthropy tends to be implemented directly without going through other civil society organizations. And so there's first an issue here to address around increasing grant making as a practice, especially in a place like Brazil, where it's still, I think, only about half of the philanthropic funds that go through grant making, or even maybe a bit less. Then there is so the question about trust. How do you maybe create the ecosystem, the infrastructure that allows to create that trust, and also that changes the practices of donors so that they don't expect the world to change for them, but that they change for the world, if you want. So that, but that also takes this ecosystem or this infrastructure to explain how that can be done and why that should be done. And I think that is it was highlighted the important role of Elas and other networks, you know, in all the successes and that were presented through this research. I think that it's really critical, because if you don't have an infrastructure that can build that trust, then you're not necessarily going to have the kind of support that the change needs. So that's something we're working on a lot at Wings. We really try to help build a stronger, more diverse ecosystem of actors that can really expand philanthropic work, including local philanthropic work. And that's something we're also trying to include in other big discussions at the global level, such as the sort of the aid localization agenda, really about how do we get more funding to local organizations, etc. And we're basically saying we also need to think about how do we localize resources for local development, and how do we create that local infrastructure, local ecosystem that can shift that reality. And that's something that we believe has a lot of potential, and we're happy to also spread the word about the critical impact of Elas and other important organizations doing this kind of work on the ground. And I think more broadly, I would maybe end around that. I know we're almost reaching the hour, but I think that, yes, there were questions about, is there a shift in philanthropy? Will philanthropy become more progressive? Or and I think that, yes, there is definitely a trend, and it has to be encouraged, and including around issues that such as racial equity, more particularly. I find it interesting to see that the mainstream, sort of the main association of foundations in Brazil, GIFE, is reflecting on that kind of topic, and they're putting it also as part of their strategy and sort of key priorities to address the sort of racial equity agenda. And we've seen that in other networks who are not known for being sort of activist network, but still they're starting to integrate these issues. And I think it's a lot about understanding that it's not a specific cause, or it's not another world or another issue that you're not talking about if you're a funder for education or for culture or environment or whatever. But it's more about the way you work and how that can be integrated transversally in your work, both supporting local organizations, including a gender lens in your work. And that also applies to other big transversal issues that are all, of course, interconnected. And so Wings, we're trying to accelerate that shift, actually. So that's very much what we're trying to do, and influence the norms that shape the field. And we believe that there's an opportunity right now, and so we're just going to keep supporting that. And we want to be able to document the examples you were sharing. Something we'll do. Actually, we'll have in the coming months a specific project that will also document best practices around women's philanthropy and gender-focused philanthropy. And we'll also have a specific initiative in the Latin American region to see how to support the development of women's philanthropy in Latin America. And so we're very much on board with the agenda, and happy to build the bridges with the broader philanthropic sector, which we believe is really critical if we want to go beyond the usual circles of those who are convinced, and really make it more of a mainstream practice to work with local organizations and women's funds, for instance. So congratulations again, and thank you for inviting me.
Muito obrigada, Benjamin.
Thank you, Benjamin. I want to say that we are volunteers. Elas is a volunteer to collaborate with the research round and data collection about Latin America and this investment with gender and race lens. So you can count us in if you need. And we truly want to share everything we want. We want to share our knowledge and our experience. And 21 years of Elas Plus, and years and years that are needed for us to reach the education that we believe, this transformation that we believe. I would like to ask our technical team to put everyone in the screen here, because I want to thank you. I want to deeply thank you with all my heart, everyone that were here with us today. And I want to thank you, Natalia Caruso. Thank you very much. Alex Garita, thank you. Maria Eduarda, it was great to have you here. Benjamin, also thank you. It was great to hear from you, to hear your point of view. And Iracema Souza, the researcher from for this survey, for this research of activism pandemic in Brazil. I would like to remind you once again that our research is available in Portuguese and also in English, both languages in our website. And we are also open to have sessions if you need roundtables with other. For example, if Wings want to do a roundtable about the research, we can organize this. There's not a problem with UN Women, with Próspera Madre, and we know that some of you are interested to do that, and also other partners. So now I pass the floor to have the last word to Amalia Fischer. And I thank you once again. It was great to have you all here. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Thank you for those who are watching us, who are listening through YouTube. Thank you for the technical team that is here and making this live possible. Thank you, Kaka, for it's always great to have you here. I think that Kaka should be a TV presenter, a TV host. She's excellent doing that. And well, we are very happy to be here for what happened today, and you that accepted being here with us talking about the research. You can count on us. And thank you. Thank you once again.
Obrigada, queridas.
Obrigada, Alex.